Hello, biologists. So we are making our way through the plant kingdom. We went through our bryophytes, through our seedless vascular plants, then we got into our seed plants. We've discussed our gymnosperms, and now we're into our angiosperms. Angiosperms are plants that have two big adaptations in them. They have flowers and they have fruits. Most plants that you think of probably have flowers and fruits. Most plants, more than 90% of plants, are contained within angiosperms. So these are the most diverse and widespread plants. However, they only have one phylum, Anthophyta. So all the plants, when we discuss angiosperms, they all belong to the phylum Anthophyta. In a flower is an angiosperm structure that has been specialized for sexual reproduction. We'll go through and talk about the parts of our flower that let it allow it to have sexual reproduction occur. In a lot of plants, in a lot of these species, insects are very important as pollinators. They transfer pollen from one flower to the sex organs of another flower. Pollen is what contains the sperm, and so that sperm gets carried on the insect or on other animals to another flower where it can pollinate the ovum. However, some angiosperms are wind pollinated, and that especially occurs in dense populations like grass that don't need to travel much distance. And what we see in a lot of those angiosperms that are wind pollinated is, since they don't need to attract insects, they don't create as much of a bright, showy, attractive flower compared to what other angiosperms would produce. In the flower, it is a specialized type of shoot, and there are 4 types of modified leaves, and these leaves are actually organs of this flower. If we're starting at the outside, we have a sepal. These are sepals. They're usually green, and they cover the rest of the flower bud. Then we come into the petal. Petals are usually brightly colored to attract pollinators, and we see a lot of evolution that occurs between our flowers and our insects as they are evolving together, both to support the insect life and to support the floral life. However, wind-pollinated flowers, usually not as brightly colored. Then moving in, we have stamens. These are stamens. You can see there's multiple stamens here. Stamens are microsporophylls, or the male reproductive organs, and they are composed of an anther and a filament. And then carpels are the megasporophylls. These are the female reproductive organs, and they have a stigma. I think of sticky stigma. A lot of times you'll see sticky stigma, because it is what sticks the pollen onto it. Then the style, which leads the pollen down to the ovary. If you remember talking about our gymnosperms, where we said they were kind of a naked kind of reproductive structure, here this is not naked. This is the container. The carpel becomes the container around the seed. So this carpel is the distinguishing factor between what is a gymnosperm and what is an angiosperm. Okay, where in an angiosperm would you find a megasporangium? Okay, a stamen consists of a stalk called a filament. So each of these little stalks is a filament, and it has a terminal sac called an anther, and it is within the anther where pollen is being produced. The carpel has an ovary at its base and a style that leads to the stigma. That sticky stigma, that is where pollen is received. In a complete flower will have all 4 of these organs: sepals, petals, stamens, and carpels. Incomplete flowers will lack one or more of these organs. So you should now be able to compare and contrast a pine cone and a flower in terms of structure and function. Please feel free to pause the video to go back and review your notes, but make sure you're comfortable with what we've discussed up to this point. So watch a flower blooming and see if you can find these different parts of it. Can you find where all 4 of those reproductive organs are? Flowers have different types of symmetry. They can be radially symmetric, which means any line going through the middle of it gives you 2 equal symmetric sides. Or they can be bilaterally symmetrical, which there's only one line that will divide it into 2 equal parts. Whether they're radially symmetric or bilaterally symmetric also has a big impact on what kind of animals are able to pollinate it, what type of insects are able to get to the pollen or get to the different parts of that flower to pollinate it. Then angiosperms have fruits. So as a seed develops, the ovary wall will thicken and the ovary matures into a fruit. So if you've ever grown, tomatoes or anything in your garden, you may notice first it gets flowers, and then those flowers ripen, they mature into a fruit. So if you were to look at a pea pod, it's a fruit that has seeds in the middle of it. Those peas are the mature ovules, and they're encased by the ripened ovary or the pod. Fruits are important to seeds because they protect the seeds and also aid in their dispersal. So it makes it more likely that an animal will pick up that fruit and pass it through their reproductive system, or that it can be passed on and survive the environment. There's different variations that we see in fruits and seeds that help disperse the seeds. So some fruits, like dandelions, are parachutes that help it disperse through the wind. Some fruits like coconuts are able to float so they can disperse across the water. Some fruits are modified as burrs. They cling to animal fur and get carried away from the original plant. And then sweet tasting and vividly fruits are eaten by animals and will be dispersed in their feces.
When seeds are mature enough, the ovaries change their function and develop into seed-dispersing structures called fruits. There are many patterns of fruit development, depending on the number of carpels, ovaries, and flowers that form one fruit. Fruits can also be divided into the categories of dry fruits and fleshy fruits. In dry fruits, the ovary dries out at maturity. It may develop hooks that catch animal fur, as in this example. Or the ovary and other flower parts may form a wing or a parasol, or hairs to catch the wind. Sometimes the dry ovary builds tensions that, when released, will shoot the seeds into the air. In fleshy fruits, such as tomatoes and peaches, the outer tissues of the ovary thicken and become soft, sweet, and brightly colored. Fleshy fruits invite animal dispersal. The seeds are ingested, and if they escape digestion, they are excreted with fertilizer, hopefully in a choice location.
Okay, so your textbook says, I've never heard anyone else say, but your textbook says that it's been said that an oak is an acorn's way of making more acorns. So describe oak trees and acorns using these terms: sporophyte, gametophyte, ovule, seed, ovary, and fruit. Okay, those are all vocabulary words that at this point you should be comfortable with. So go through and describe those in terms of those structures. In the angiosperms, they have a life cycle where male gametophytes are contained within pollen grains produced in the microsporangia of the anthers. That's right here. And ovules develop within the ovary and contain a female gametophyte, also called an embryo sac, and the egg is contained within the embryo sac. And I am going to pause and pull up this video to show you. Okay, the video I wanted to play for you isn't playing, so I'm going to try this one instead.
Angiosperms are plants that reproduce by means of flowers. Flowers are showy, colorful structures made of modified leaves. A flower usually contains both male and female reproductive structures. A flower can have up to 4 types of modified leaves: petals, sepals, carpels, which consist of a stigma, style, and ovary, and stamens, which consist of an anther and filament. Ovules and megasporocytes are present inside the ovary. Let's review the sequential stages of the angiosperm life cycle. The process that occurs in the ovary, which initiates the development of female gametophytes, is the division of a megasporocyte by meiosis. Inside an ovule, the megasporocyte, 2N, undergoes meiosis to form 4 cells, but only one of these cells survives as the megaspore, N. The nucleus of the megaspore divides by mitosis 3 times, resulting in one large cell with 8 haploid nuclei. Membranes then grow between these nuclei to form a multicellular structure called the embryo sac, which is the female gametophyte. The large egg cell is located at one end of the embryo sac. A diploid cell within the anther divides by meiosis to form 4 microspores, N. Each microspore, N, divides once by mitosis to form 2 cells. A tough wall is formed around the outside, creating a pollen grain, which contains a male gametophyte. Pollen grains are transferred by wind, water, or an animal to a sticky stigma in a flower of the same plant or another individual of the same species. After a pollen grain lands on the stigma, it forms a pollen tube that elongates downward through the style into the ovary. 2 sperm nuclei, N, form inside the pollen tube. The pollen tube enters the ovary and releases the 2 sperm nuclei into the embryo sac. One sperm nucleus fertilizes the egg, forming a diploid zygote. The other sperm nucleus fuses with 2 nuclei in the center of the ovule to form a triploid 3N cell that will develop into a nutritive tissue called endosperm. This process is called double fertilization. The triploid cell divides rapidly by mitosis to form endosperm, a tissue rich in starch, lipids, and proteins. The zygote divides by mitosis to form a sporophyte embryo with a rudimentary root and 1 or 2 cotyledons, seed leaves. The integuments of the ovule become a tough seed coat with the embryo and endosperm inside. As the ovules develop into seeds, the ovary surrounding the ovules develops into the fruit, which will protect and help disperse the seeds. The fruit falls to the ground and seeds germinate. A seedling uses the food stored in the endosperm and cotyledons to grow until it can begin photosynthesis. The young plant grows into a mature sporophyte that produces flowers, and the cycle continues.
Okay, so that video, feel free to replay it. Go back and play again as you need to become comfortable with how we're creating the egg, the pollen, what's going on in double fertilization, and then how we end up with a germinating seed. That's what we just played. Pollination is when pollen from one flower is released from the anther and carried to the sticky stigma at the tip of the carpel. Some flowers can self-pollinate. That means the pollen from that flower can pollinate its own, can fertilize its own ovums. However, most plants have mechanisms to only have cross-pollination. Cross-pollination means the pollen has to come from a different individual to pollinate that plant. So sometimes that may involve stamens and carpels of a single flower maturing at different times. So the stamen will be mature when other flowers have carpels ready, or the carpels may mature when the other flowers have stamens ready. So they're not able to pollinate themselves. That's a little bit important because cross-pollination assures a little bit more variety of genetic information, and variety is always helpful so that your species can survive as a whole. Okay, double fertilization, what we just discussed, is when pollen grains germinate on the stigma and produce a pollen tube that goes down into the ovary, and the pollen tube penetrates the micropyle. That's the pore in the integuments, and discharges 2 sperm cells. So not 1 sperm like we saw in animals, but 2 sperm cells. Both sperm cells are used, and that is what double fertilization means. 1 sperm will fertilize the egg and form a diploid zygote that will go on to mature to become the plant. And the other sperm fuses with 2 nuclei in the embryonic sac, which produces a triploid cell. And that cell is going to become the endosperm that will provide a source of food and protection for the developing embryo.
The function of flowering is to produce seeds and disperse them to locations where the young plants are likely to survive. At each step, there is an emphasis on protecting the offspring. This activity reviews some of the most important steps. Events in seed formation begin with pollination, in which wind or animals bring pollen to the flower. The growth of pollen tubes caused the flower to discard its colorful parts, petals and stamen. After pollen arrives, the bright petals are a hazard. They attract animals that might eat the delicate young fruit. We've enlarged the ovary and sliced it open. An ovary contains 1 or more ovules that will become seeds if they are fertilized. 1 ovule is shown here, with the front removed to reveal its parts. The ovule is attached to the ovary wall by a stalk that provides nutrients. Starting from a pollen grain at the stigma, which is not shown, a pollen tube grows down through the carpel to the ovule. It carries 2 sperm that enter the ovule. 1 sperm fuses with the egg cell to make a zygote, which is the first cell of the embryo. The other sperm fuses with the 2 nuclei in the central cell, making a triploid nucleus. The triploid cell will grow and divide to make a food-storing tissue, the endosperm.
Okay, so now you should be able to describe the process of double fertilization. I'm going to conclude this part of the lecture video. However, we're not done talking about our flowers, so please come back and we'll finish our discussion of this chapter just in one more little video. I'll see you soon. Bye.